The first time I saw her, it felt like the room had shifted, like the air had grown heavier with unspoken words I wasn't supposed to hear. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that made everyone else seem tentative, even me. Mid-40s, graceful in a way that was almost effortless. Yet when she laughed, it carried a vulnerability that made me want to lean in closer, to memorize the way the corners of her eyes softened. I was supposed to be here just to help her sister with a few exercises, to keep my head down and my instructions neutral. But every time she stepped into my view, every time her shoulder brushed past mine or she reached for a weight, something unspoken flickered between us. I noticed the way her hand lingered a moment longer than necessary near mine, the way her eyes seemed to catch mine just when I thought I'd hidden my glance. Her sister didn't notice, absorbed in her routine, but I did. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, something warm, earthy, with a hint of vanilla, and the subtle warmth radiating from her as she moved closer. My chest tightened when she tilted her head, listening to me explain a stretch, the small rise and fall of her breath brushing against my awareness. I tried to focus on the exercises, on the counting, but the room had changed. It was smaller, closer, charged. She smiled once, softly, not at her sister, not at anyone else, just at me. And in that fraction of a second, her eyes held something like curiosity, maybe even a question I wasn't ready to answer. My hands brushed hers while adjusting a posture, nothing overt, but enough that a shiver ran up my arm. I felt the weight of her attention, the gentle insistence of her presence that made ordinary movements feel electric. Her voice was lower than I expected, warm and slightly husky when she asked a simple question, almost teasing. I stumbled over the words, over my own pulse, and she laughed quietly, a sound that lingered like it wanted to be remembered. Every subtle gesture, the tilt of her head, the shift of her hips as she leaned into the stretch, the faint tightening of her jaw, seemed to communicate something I couldn't name, something neither of us dared speak aloud. And yet, before I could even decide how to respond, the quiet bubble of tension broke. The gym door opened, and her sister's phone rang loudly, jangling across the room. She glanced up, startled, and I could feel the moment slipping away, the charged space between us dissolving into the mundane sound of a ringtone. But even as I moved to answer, her eyes caught mine again, longer this time, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw her want something more than the casual excuse of exercise. And just like that, the world outside the room seemed irrelevant. All that mattered was the unspoken gravity between us, and the question hovering in the space we weren't allowed to name. I kept telling myself it was just the training, just professional courtesy. But every time I watched her stretch or adjust her stance, I caught myself noticing things I wasn't supposed to. The faint curve of her neck, the soft way her hair fell over her shoulder, the subtle way her fingers lingered when she brushed past me. It made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. She wasn't easy to read. Confident, yet careful, like she'd been through enough to know how quickly a simple connection could become complicated. I suspected a life full of compromises, long hours, responsibilities, relationships that had faded quietly. And maybe that's why she carried herself with such precision, why she measured her glances and smiles. I, on the other hand, was reckless with my attention, noticing everything, letting it pull me in, even when I wanted to stay distant. We both knew the rules without saying them aloud. The age gap, the social whispers that might come if anyone noticed our closeness, the personal hesitation that lingered like a shadow between us. Yet none of that could stop the tiny, electric moments, the accidental brush of a hand, the faint warmth of her body near mine as she leaned in to ask a question, the soft exhale of her breath close enough to feel on my cheek. Once, she lingered a second too long adjusting my posture during a stretch. Her hand rested lightly on my shoulder. I froze, my muscles stiffening, unsure if she'd noticed the pulse racing beneath my shirt. She smiled, eyes holding mine for a fleeting moment, before stepping back and pretending nothing had happened. The retreat made the moment burn brighter, a quiet ache that settled deep in my chest. I noticed the way she sometimes stared out the window during our sessions, lost in thought, and I imagined the loneliness behind those eyes, experiences she never shared, memories I could only guess at. And I felt a strange mix of protectiveness and desire, like I wanted to reach through the space between us and hold on to the unspoken part of her that didn't belong to anyone else. Our interactions became a series of these near misses and careful touches, a dance neither of us could name. And yet, there were moments that made the distance unbearable, a shared laugh, the brush of her hand as she adjusted my stance, the way her voice softened when she asked if I was comfortable holding the stretch. In those brief seconds, the room seemed to shrink until it existed only for us. By the end of the session, she paused near the door, hand resting lightly on the frame, turning to glance back at me. The silence stretched between us, full of things neither of us dared say. I felt it. The pull, the quiet electricity of two people teetering on the edge of something that had no name, but felt unavoidable. And when our eyes met, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going away anytime soon. I was adjusting her posture when the phone buzzed loudly on the counter. Startled, she jerked slightly, and our bodies collided almost imperceptibly. My hand still rested on her lower back. Hers brushed against mine as she turned toward the ringing phone. The interruption should have broken the tension, but instead, it made the air between us heavier, tighter, more urgent. She answered quickly, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her profile, the curve of her cheek, the way her lips moved softly as she spoke. Every small detail seemed magnified, and I was painfully aware of the warmth radiating from her, close enough to make my pulse spike. When she laughed at something said on the other end, the sound brushed against me, lingering in the space where it didn't belong. A sudden knock at the door made her startle again, and we both froze. Her sister's voice called from the other room, asking if she was almost done. The closeness between us suddenly felt exposed, wrong, thrilling. I tried to step back, but she didn't move either, and the distance between our bodies shrank to mere inches. My breath caught when her shoulder brushed mine. Her gaze met mine, long and steady, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might reach out, or worse, I might. My hands itched to touch her face, to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, but I froze, knowing that the moment was too fragile to act on. The air was thick with unsaid words, the near miss of something we both wanted but couldn't have yet. We moved almost instinctively, adjusting her stance together. Her hand lingered on my arm slightly longer than needed, and I felt a shiver run through me at the contact. Her breath hitched subtly when I leaned in to correct her posture, the warm exhale brushing against my temple. My chest pressed involuntarily closer to hers, the line between teacher and trainee dissolving into something far more dangerous. I wanted to speak, to name the pull between us, but the words stuck. Instead, we traded glances that said more than language could convey: hesitation, desire, guilt, and the unspoken acknowledgement that we were treading a line neither of us should. The room seemed to shrink until only we existed, hearts pounding, breaths mingling, fingers brushing accidentally yet deliberately. Then she stepped back slightly, as if the movement would restore propriety, and I almost followed, but I didn't. Instead, we stayed suspended in that fragile space, closer than ever, caught in a magnetic pull neither of us could resist. For one perfect, suspended second, I imagined pressing my lips to hers, feeling the warmth, tasting the hesitation, but reality intruded, and we stayed frozen, eyes locked, the tension simmering, unresolved. And as the door opened again with a faint creak, I realized something I hadn't dared admit. Whatever this was, it wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a quiet inevitability, a force neither of us could fully fight. And yet, we tried, even as the distance between us vanished again. The room felt smaller than ever, the air thick with heat and unsaid words. I couldn't stop noticing her, the way her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she caught her breath after a stretch, the faint scent of her perfume that clung to the space around her. My hands itched to reach for her, to brush a loose strand behind her ear, but I held back, pretending to adjust her posture. She looked up at me then, and something in her eyes shifted, hesitation, desire, a challenge I didn't know how to meet. My chest tightened as if it had a mind of its own, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without noticing. I wanted to speak, to warn her, to say something that would dissolve the tension, but my voice faltered. Instead, I leaned slightly closer, drawn by the magnetism between us. Her hand lingered on my arm, brushing lightly, almost shyly, and I felt an electric pulse shoot through me. She didn't pull away, even as I could sense her own restraint. There was a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or anticipation, hidden behind her calm exterior. I wanted to ask her about it, but the words caught in my throat. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke first. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and I had to lean in to hear. "You notice me too much," she said, eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. Her words weren't a rebuke. They were a confession, fragile and dangerous. I can't help it," I admitted, my voice trembling just enough to betray my control. "Every time you move, I notice. Every time you look at me." I let the sentence trail, swallowed by the space between us. Her lips parted slightly, and I imagined the feel of them against mine. My hand hovered near her face, my fingers trembling as I fought the impulse to touch her. She leaned just enough that our bodies almost met, the heat from her pressing against me in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. For a moment, the world outside the room didn't exist. The clock ticking, the faint hum of the gym equipment, even her sister's distant voice, all vanished. There was only her, and the pull between us, raw and unrelenting. My breath mingled with hers. My heart pounded in a rhythm that matched hers. Every small movement, a brush of her fingers, a tilt of her head, sent sparks through me that I couldn't ignore. And then she said it, softly, almost teasingly, but with a gravity I couldn't miss. "Do you want this as much as I do?" The words hung in the air like a spark over dry kindling. I leaned closer, drawn beyond reason, the space between our lips shrinking with every heartbeat. Her eyes closed briefly, and I felt the weight of possibility pressing down on us. But before anything could happen, a sudden knock at the door made us both jump, hearts racing, breaths uneven, and the moment fractured. Yet even as we pulled back, the heat, the desire, the tension lingered, thick, unresolved, impossible to ignore. The next session started like any other, but the air felt different, charged, fragile, like walking on glass. I was setting up a mat when she appeared at the doorway, pausing just long enough for our eyes to meet. Something in her expression made my stomach knot, guarded, almost apologetic, but still holding that undeniable pull. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low, almost shaking. She stepped closer, and I noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I stayed still, my own hands clenching at my sides, waiting. Her confession came quickly, like a dam breaking. "I've been avoiding admitting it, even to myself. But I notice you, more than I should." She swallowed, her eyes darting toward the mat as if expecting judgment or rejection, but she didn't stop. I felt my pulse spike. Her words weren't new to me. I'd known, or at least guessed, but hearing them, whispered and hesitant, made everything feel dangerous. My chest tightened, and my hands itched to reach for her, though I froze, torn between propriety and the magnetic pull that had been building for weeks. Before I could respond, her sister entered the room unexpectedly, calling out about an equipment problem. She started, nearly stepping on the mat, and in the momentary distraction, our bodies brushed. My shoulder collided softly with hers, a shock of warmth racing through me. She gasped, and I felt the brush of her hand against mine. Too fleeting to be accidental, too electrifying to ignore. We both stepped back, pretending to rearrange the weights, but the tension didn't dissipate. Every glance, every breath between us carried the weight of what had been confessed. Her lips pressed together for a moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, almost as if she was asking herself whether to step forward or retreat. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. She leaned slightly toward me and whispered, just barely audible. "I don't know if this is safe, but I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore." The words hit me, grounding the desire I'd been trying to ignore and layering it with a sudden fear of consequences. Our eyes locked, unblinking, and the room seemed to shrink until it existed only for us. Her fingers brushed my arm once more, a touch that lingered long enough to make me dizzy, and I felt the magnetic pull drawing us together despite the risk. My lips parted, caught between warning and want, and I realized neither of us could step back without acknowledging the inevitable. And just as the tension threatened to spill over, just as I imagined leaning in closer, feeling her warmth against me fully, the gym door opened again. A distant voice called out, mundane yet intrusive, forcing us to freeze, eyes still locked, hearts racing, and desire unspoken but impossible to ignore. The choice hung between us, retreat or surrender to the gravity that had been building since the very first touch. The room was quiet, almost unbearably so, the usual hum of equipment fading into nothingness. She stood near the mat, close enough that the faint scent of her perfume wrapped around me, mingling with the warmth radiating from her body. Every instinct screamed to step forward, to close the small distance that remained between us. But the rules, the consequences, held me back, if only slightly. Her eyes found mine, unwavering, and I could see the vulnerability she usually hid behind her confident posture. There was no pretense here, no measured control, just the raw pull of wanting something forbidden. My hands itched to reach for her, to feel the brush of her fingers against mine again, but instead I let them hover near her arm, trembling slightly. "I don't know if we should," she whispered, voice low, almost a tremor. Her words were caution, but every syllable carried desire, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been building for weeks. I swallowed hard, leaning in just enough that her breath brushed my cheek. "I don't care," I admitted, voice rough. I can't stop noticing you." Her hand lifted slowly, tentatively, and rested against my chest. The warmth of her touch sent a jolt straight through me. Neither of us moved too quickly, not wanting to break the fragile tension, but every second stretched until it felt infinite. Our breaths mingled, hearts hammering in sync, the world outside the room reduced to a distant hum. I leaned closer, careful, hesitant, tracing a line from her shoulder to her jaw with my eyes. Her lips parted slightly, a quiet invitation, and I felt a pull I couldn't resist. She tilted her head toward me, and our foreheads nearly touched, the space between us charged with everything we hadn't dared to speak aloud. The choice was clear, yet terrifying. One step forward, and nothing would be the same. One step back, and this fragile tension, the quiet electricity that had defined our every interaction, would be lost forever. I whispered her name softly, letting the sound linger in the air, and she responded by closing the final inch, letting her body lean into mine. Our hands met, fingers intertwining naturally, not needing words to acknowledge the pull between us. The room seemed to hold its breath along with us, every second stretched taut, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in the quiet. And then, without fanfare, without ceremony, we surrendered, not recklessly, but fully, humanly, messily. Not a kiss, not yet, but the acknowledgement that neither of us could deny the gravity of what was here, what we were to each other. For the first time, the barriers dissolved. We understood each other fully, the desire, the fear, the risk, and the inevitability of what we had discovered in one another. The tension remained, thick and alive, but now it was shared, mutual, and undeniable. In that quiet, suspended moment, we didn't need words. Everything had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. The gym was quieter than usual, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows in golden streams. We sat on the edge of the mat, legs nearly touching, neither speaking at first. The air between us was still heavy with the pull of what had passed, but now it carried something softer, steadier, a sense of mutual understanding. She leaned her shoulder lightly against mine, a small, deliberate contact that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. I rested my hand over hers, fingers curling naturally around hers, and felt the tension of weeks, the longing, hesitation, and silent confessions, ease just enough to breathe. "You don't regret it?" I asked quietly, almost afraid of her answer. Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Not for a second," she whispered, tilting her head to glance at me. Her eyes held warmth, amusement, and something deeper, something like relief that we had finally acknowledged the truth between us. I wanted to speak, to tell her everything I'd thought, felt, and hoped for, but words weren't necessary. Instead, I drew her a little closer, resting my forehead against hers. Her hand tightened slightly around mine, and I felt her exhale softly, a subtle surrender, a quiet acceptance of what we both had needed for so long. The age gap, the risk, the fear of judgment, they all seemed to meld away in that small, shared space. Nothing outside mattered. It was just her and me, here and now, finally aligned. The soft brush of her hair against my cheek, the warmth radiating from her side pressed against mine, the subtle cadence of our breaths. All of it was a quiet, sensual affirmation of what we had discovered together. After a long moment, she rested her head against my shoulder. I tightened my hold just slightly, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing. We didn't speak, but the silence was filled with understanding, a connection forged in longing, hesitation, and slow, messy human desire, now solidified in trust and intimacy. Eventually, we sat back slightly, fingers still intertwined, smiling at each other in a quiet, unspoken agreement. The tension that had defined us for weeks had transformed into warmth, companionship, and a slow-burning promise that neither distance nor doubt could erase. For the first time, the world outside could exist without threatening what we had created. We had crossed the invisible line, acknowledged our feelings, and emerged on the other side, together, whole, and undeniably present for one another. As we rose to leave, her hand still in mine, I felt a quiet thrill, a sense that whatever came next, we would face it side by side. And in that perfect, human moment, the story of our slow-burn connection finally felt complete. 19.